We okay? So tell me when to roll. Oh, we're going? Welcome back. This is week 2, our second week of the course where we're addressing food labels and some of the issues and some of the information surrounding food labels. And this is our second virtual office hour. And I am Jamie Pope, and this is Heather Bumbelow, who is joining me. We're both registered dietitians, and Heather is my primary teaching staff for this course. So you've probably, if you're on the discussion forum, you've seen a lot of visibility with Heather there. Thank you for interacting there. We will be holding these virtual office hours each week throughout the course. That's a new thing for this offering, and for several reasons. One is we want to just kind of elaborate on topics and be able to discuss some of the things that might have changed since those videos were initially filmed, or even some of the content that is a little controversial now, that will, and address some of the topics on the discussion forum and answer your questions, which you can actually submit through the Google Meetup site. That link is provided. If you're with us, you might already be there. But so try to plan, if you can, to come back each Wednesday. One of the weeks we actually be doing a demo in a kitchen on campus. When we talk about plant-based diets, I believe it's that week. So we'll be doing some interesting things. If you have questions, you can submit them. A little later, we're going to be looking at some of those questions. And even as part of our discussion, we're going to bring up some of the topics that we've seen come up on the discussion forum. So, okay, well, let's get rolling. I wanted to talk a little bit about food labeling, and I'm not going to reiterate what was all in the videos, but when you think about food labels, they're there to inform consumers is their primary reason. And to inform them not only in terms of what's in a food, in terms of ingredients, in terms of nutritional value, to meet their basic nutrient needs, but also how a food might relate to like disease risk and what kind of foods they would choose maybe to reduce sodium intake or reduce added sugars or whatever kind of component that they're looking at on that label. Another aspect of food labels is an incentive to food companies. When trans fats were required to be on the label in 2006, which I think was the last time we saw.
Yeah, that was the last major change to the food labels.
Was in 6? And at that point we saw some food manufacturers step back and reformulate their products so that they could declare lower trans fat content. It also holds food companies accountable to some degree in terms of making known what's in their food products and how those add up in terms of content. So all those things come into play with food labels. A lot of people read food labels. Actually, some of the recent surveys show numbers declining a little bit. And I think part of that is increased awareness. People, I think, already know, particularly if they're buying similar products often, they're already familiar with what's on the label.
True. So you just always go back and get the same one that you're used
So you don't
to getting.
have to necessarily read the label. But do you have any thoughts on why you might see some declines in using food labels?
It's either awareness. Maybe some people aren't familiar with how to read them. It can be a little overwhelming. But like you said, maybe they just get hooked on certain products, so that's what they choose all the time. Or some people are just pushing more towards whole foods, so they're not really buying those processed foods.
That's a great point.
Have labels.
That's a great point, and that's probably what we should be doing. Is buying less processed foods and emphasizing more whole foods in our diets. As part of week 2. For the assignment, for those of you that are engaging at that level in the course, the assignment asks for 2 things. One, for the U.S. students to propose some thoughts on what they would like to see changed about our current food label. And excitingly enough, we've already seen some of that translated into actually a proposed label that we're going to look at in a minute. And then for our students from outside the U.S., they were asked to, maybe talk about how their labels in their country, their listing of nutrition information, differed from that in the U.S. And if they would like to post a food label. And we already have a huge thread, it's in your announcement today, to those labels that students are posting. And Heather and my former teaching associate, Daniel Jimenez, put together a PowerPoint with food labels from around the world.
Yeah, so the last 2 offerings, students posted labels from their country and sort of explained the differences. So we took some of those labels and put them in a PowerPoint going with the country they came from. So it's a big document, so sorry if it's difficult to download, but we split it into 3. So if you want to view that, it's a great tool just to compare and see that the whole world doesn't have a standardized label, but usually some countries do and some countries don't have a standardized label.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, because you've looked at it even closer than I have in terms of when you put the PowerPoint together. What did you notice in terms of maybe differences from the U.S. label, standardization like you mentioned?
Some countries, within one country, you might have a label that has a lot of information, and then same country but very limited nutritional information, and then
so not standardized like in the U.S. Every product has to have the same format, the same content.
Some were more colorful and had more visuals, easier to read. Some have multiple languages.
It's so fascinating to me to look at the labels. Some of them, of course, I can't read, but you still can get the gist.
Yeah.
And Heather and I both went
today
to the grocery store, and she found a product, and I found a product. What was interesting, we were talking last week, and we were talking about products that were imported from other countries into the U.S. And what about their food labels? Did they have their country of origin label, or did they have a U.S. label? And what was interesting, and I don't think we need to zoom in on this, but I'll just hold it up, is that on this side is the label, and it's covered up, but I think this is from the United Kingdom. A label on the side that has nutrition information on it, and then a little sticker with a comparable U.S. format label. And I think yours was the same thing.
I found just like a coconut candy bar, and I noticed it had its own label in different languages that I personally can't read, but they also, the United States, we put a sticker on it with our format of the nutrition label and the ingredients listed and a barcode. So it was just neat to see that, I mean, if we're importing products, we're not making those companies adapt their label for us, but we just our own label to the product.
That's great points. Great points. I wanted to share just a few of the things that you as students submitted in terms of recommendations for changes in the food label. And as we'll see, actually some of your recommendations are reflected in the changes, that you picked things that actually FDA also considered. Consumers also were able to comment and provide input into the label format. I think that closed for FDA October 1st. Oh, I know one thing I wanted to mention. I know that this week focuses around the U.S. food label, and that's just context. In part because I hope that certain aspects of the U.S. food label translate across the board. And, you know, it's just kind of our context here is to teach from that label, but hopefully you can adapt it and some of the components to food labels anywhere. And we've tried to bring in some of the international aspects by asking students to share perspectives on that and share photographs. And we've made some resources available too. But I thought it was interesting, and we together some of the things that came out were looking a little more information about sugar. And yes, the newer food label, the proposed version has a new component of added sugar, which would be above and beyond what would be naturally occurring in a food. If high fructose corn syrup is added, if sucrose is added, or if any of the many names for sugar are added to a food product. Several students asked for larger font size, larger print on food labels, so it's easier to read, it's not so small. Some of that I think is limited by the packaging and the packaging size. In fact, we pulled a couple of labels today of food products, and just the difference in the size, although the font looks similar, it's just that this label's a lot more extensive than others. But some labels were so small that you couldn't even really use those. But this is the original food label. And a lot of people talked about realistic serving sizes, and this is one that's interesting to me. That per law here in the U.S., FDA mandates that the serving size on food labels reflect what people actually eat, not what they should eat. And our current food labels reflect more towards that should, like a half a cup of ice cream, a half a cup of rice, a half a cup, that the servings are more in line, say, with the My Plate or the old pyramid, instead of actually what people consume. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that makes it really difficult as a consumer, especially if you don't know how to read the label, because you might have a snack that actually the bag might contain 2 or 3 servings, but the nutrition label only addresses the nutrition information for 1 serving. So it's important for us to teach consumers that you have to learn how to multiply, look at the serving size first, and then take that into consideration as you're eating, and if you're trying to figure out the total amount of calories. Also with beverages, a lot of times you buy a beverage and you drink the whole thing and you don't realize you've drank about 2 servings.
Yeah. And I think the new label proposal reflects some of that, is that if it's a package that realistically you could consume the whole thing in one sitting, but the serving is less than that whole package, that they're going to have a dual format for a per serving and a per package. So that's been proposed now. Also, more prominent listing on the top of the label in terms of the number of servings that are contained in a product. So people see that. But in terms of changing the portion size on a food label to reflect what we actually consume versus what is maybe more desirable in terms of a serving size, that's challenging. Will that encourage people to eat more, or to think, this is a normal serving size? Maybe it is normal in terms of typical intake, but not normal or necessarily healthy. So what do you feel about that?
I'm wondering if we move towards making our label reflect what we normally eat, if then consumers just start to, I don't know if they would eat more, or they would just think that is the right amount to eat, and then they might eventually start eating more than that, and then we might change the label again. So I don't know if that would affect our overall obesity epidemic.
It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see, number one, how those servings might change on new food labels from what we have currently, and how that'll impact eating behavior and perception of what's a, quote, normal or appropriate serving size. So it's going to be interesting to follow that. So you want to share a couple other things that people...
Yes,
so here we go.
Other students mentioned having pictures on the label. Some people, not everyone knows how to read and understand, so visuals may be helpful. And Professor Pope does, in her class here at Vanderbilt, she has students come up with labels or just suggestions how they could change it, and they get in groups and make these posters, and this one looks like it shows these visuals. Let's say for total fat, that out of the whole bar would reflect how much you're supposed to have in a day, and then this particular product might only have about almost 50% of it. So this is just an idea of students here in the U.S.
They even put the calories and the contribution visually in a graphic representation of the number of calories. So my students in my class actually do the same assignment that week too. They propose, and I put them in groups to do this project, come up with recommendations for changes on the food label as if they were on an FDA subcommittee making these recommendations. What would they recommend to FDA? And then go a step further and actually design a label. And then they present it to the class. And this was one that was interesting to me because they included the graphic. They included glycemic index and some other indices too. And just while I'm showing these, I'm going to have to drink some water. This was one very good artist here that proposed a label, and one of their points was that trans fats needed to be not rounded, that it needed to be absolute, that currently anything less than 0.5 can count itself as 0, but to actually declare the actual amount, they're recommending adding gluten, which, is a an interesting concept that maybe we'll address more in week 7, standardized serving sizes between similar products, and define regulations for natural.
Yes.
And we can talk about that maybe a little later, that natural designation.
Other students posted on the discussion forum that they would like the dates to be more prominent. So either the production date, so when was this product made, or if it's a plant source, when was it harvested or packaged,
and then the use by, sell by, expires, all those labels. I thought you made a great point earlier that right now you do literally have to look all over a package to find where they're putting that date, and sometimes it's so hard to read.
Right.
So if it was in a consistent spot on the label where you knew where to look, and that it was in bold enough type that you could actually read it, would be helpful. At least that's how it is in the U.S. I don't know if it's other spots or not. I thought it was interesting that several students mentioned the nutrients that actually are proposed to be on the new label.
Oh, like vitamin D?
Vitamin D, potassium, and that those should be included. Several were big fans of the UK traffic light system, which we show in the videos, that uses a color coding. And even a group of my students did something similar to that with, again, a visual, that low in sugar, medium in calories, medium in fat, medium in salt, and to kind of designate the aspects of the different nutrients using a color coding.
Yeah.
And that was recommended, and right now that's something that is used, as far as I know, in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, it's easier to see when you pick up the box.
Right, right.
Also, some students mentioned having that barcode scanner on the product or near the nutrition facts label. And I know some products are doing that, and some mobile apps are accommodating that, where you can actually scan them from a phone, or and then it'll pop up in your app. I know I've used it in MyFitnessPal and some of the apps that we recommended for your assignment last week. So I think that's just a really neat how technology is adapting to improve our health or just make us more aware.
And not only does it pop up sometimes just the information, but actually some of the apps rank the food or give you, kind of an insight into how that food might compare to others, or how it would fall on a scale. And speaking of scales, several students recommended some sort of front of package single indicator, whether it be a score or whether it be some of these color codings, so that consumers don't have to always pick up and read the label, that there's actually some information on the front that at a glance you can tell. And I presented in the videos the concept of NuVal and some of the other ones that are currently being used, usually on a private level. There's not really a federal type label system. UK has it with the traffic system on the front, traffic light system. But great comments that you guys came up with for that.
So we would like to show you the proposed label here in the United States. And like we said, the comment period for the public, I think, just ended right before August. So they're still in the process of moving forward with this, and it's not a set law yet. But first, we wanted to show you, if we could zoom in on this, we have the original label. So this is what we currently have in the United States. And as you can see at the top, the serving size is listed at the top and how many servings per container. Yes, and then...
Whoops, sorry. Whoops, sorry. I missed it.
There we go.
I won't touch it.
And then if you want to point out the calories, there are the calories. And then on the right-hand side are the percent daily values. And you can see under total fat, it lists the saturated fat, the trans fat. And then we wanted to point out at the bottom the vitamins listed. There's vitamin A and vitamin C, and then calcium and iron. So for the new proposed label, other way, there we go. So here's the new
I put a link
label
in today's email about this too.
Perfect. So as even students suggested, they wanted to make the calories more prominent and the serving size more prominent. So this proposed label does that. So you can see at the top 8 servings per container.
Which is a lot more prominent too in bold type, how many servings per container.
Yes. And then the calorie size is the most prominent, I think.
Yes.
That's the first thing I notice.
And they moved the daily value to the left instead of to the right. They took off percent calories from fat, which really wasn't something people were using or was very helpful to people. So that's not going to be on there anymore, at least by the proposed. Saturated fat, trans fat still listed. I noticed trans fat is italicized. I'm not quite sure why. And we're going to talk a little bit about sat fat, trans fat today too. And then the added sugars is new here. And then the nutrients changed.
Oh yes, so now it's going to be mandatory to have, well, if this law goes through, to have vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium. So then the vitamin A and C would be voluntary.
Right. They'd be voluntary. And you can see, like on some labels, like this is a current label. This is a cereal product. It lists a ton of nutrients on here.
So is that just voluntary by
that
the
is
company?
Voluntary, or if they make a claim, like on the label, they might have said, fortified with 12 essential vitamins and minerals. Then yes, if there's a claim made about a specific nutrient that's not mandatory, then it has to be included. But they'd be replacing the A and C on the proposed label with vitamin D and with potassium, which are nutrients of concern in the U.S. in that most Americans consume too little of those nutrients. So trying to help people promote more. Calcium, iron as well, particularly for women, don't tend to consume as much. So, highlighting more of these nutrients of concern so that people can see how foods contribute towards that intake, which is a great idea. Some other things that the new label would propose is we talked about some of these reflecting what people actually do eat instead of what they, quote, should eat. Calories more prominent.
And then at the bottom, they want to put a footnote explaining the percent daily values a little more, because they're based on a 2,000 calorie diet, which doesn't apply to everybody. So I think they just want to make that more clear what a percent daily value is, and it just reflects the content of the nutrient, let's say protein or carbs, or not protein, but carbohydrates or fat per just how much you should consume in a day.
Okay. That relate to that daily value. Yes, some labels now have different calorie levels aside from the 2,000, but not all. I think they only have to include the 2,000, and the printed daily values reflect from that, not the higher. You have to kind of do the math yourself now. The term natural came up. In terms of recommendations, that is not a defined term in the U.S. in terms of a legal definition for natural. Most people assume that it means no preservatives, no, artificial additives, pesticide-free, non-GMO, all those kind of things. Right. When in actuality, it may not necessarily mean those things, and that it doesn't equate to a great food choice always. That it's more of a term that's used for marketing, and FDA's been petitioned to define it, but it's a difficult term to define. So it's kind of used arbitrarily now, and people perceive it as a beneficial type attribute of a food, but again, it particularly here in the U.S., it doesn't really have a definition. I don't know if in other countries the term natural is defined. The term organic is defined on food labels, and there are guidelines for what can be considered organic or partially organic, or however they make claims in terms of the organic content, but non-natural. So you have to kind of just almost ignore that word because you don't know what it means, or how that manufacturer might be using that term.
Or you could even call the manufacturer. Usually they have a number on the product, and you could take the effort to contact the manufacturer to figure it out for yourself.
Yes, if you're that interested in it, and particularly if it's a product you consume often, that would be great.
Yep. So if this proposed label goes through, I think manufacturers will have about 2 years to get all their products in effect, and imported products, at least for the United States, would also have to follow these new labeling laws. And And we just noticed that the link to the Google Plus page was wrong, so we just posted the correction on the Coursera page, and we sent an email out with the link. So I'm sorry if you were trying to tune in earlier and you couldn't. And if you want to ask questions, remember to log in.
I'm looking at a couple of the questions now. Maybe we can go ahead and address them even.
Yeah.
Just because they relate. Sue in Washington tells us that Ritz Fresh Stacks has a label that lists the nutrition facts for both a serving of 5 crackers and for the entire fresh snack pack.
Ooh,
and she says she
good.
loves it. So that's great. So they're already kind of being proactive in giving that, because a lot of people don't just stop at 5 crackers if they have a package.
Right.
They sit and consume them all. I know that would be hard not to do. And David in Wisconsin, he says, why not list the amounts instead of only the percentage, similar why it's done with carbs, fats, etc. I think part of the reason is people wouldn't necessarily know how to use those numbers. And different vitamins are listed sometimes in different measures, whether it be micrograms, grams, milligrams, international units. And when you look at those numbers, if you don't know the context, for example, in the U.S., the DRI or RDA for vitamin D is 600 IUs, or I think it's 600 international units. So if you saw 100, without knowing how that contributes percentage-wise, people might not know how that relates. And that's one reason they offer the percent daily value, even for the macronutrients like fat and protein is knowing those numbers, but how does that relate? And so, and the new label, I think the new label has the percent daily value for sugar, because right now there's no recommendation for sugar. And it doesn't mean that you are supposed to eat necessarily that entire amount, but is there? Nope, there's no DB for added sugar on the new label, because that'd be a hard daily value to come up with. Usually it indicates
that it's needed.
It's needed, yeah, and not necessarily. And was there one for sodium? I didn't glance at the sodium one. Does sodium have a daily value? Okay, so they've set a daily value for sodium, probably based on the DRI, because there is a certain amount of sodium we need, although most of us consume definitely more than that. And was the other a labeling question there?
Supplements.
Oh, okay.
Using
okay.
Supplements.
And about protein in particular, used for nutrition balance, good for use in diet to supplement for protein. Again, that's relative to the individual and how their diet is, quote, stacking up against recommendations. That was one benefit or one aspect of your week 1 assignment, where you actually looked at your intake over a 3-day period and compared it to what are recommended and see where you may fall short or go over, and sometimes might indicate supplementation. Most people, if they're eating a varied and balanced and adequate diet, don't need broad spectrum supplementation. But, for example, if someone is excluding, say, all dairy foods, particularly here in the U.S., where fortified milk products are a primary source of D. If you're not also eating fatty fish, which is another great source of D, then you might need a vitamin D supplement. But it really all depends, supplementation. It was interesting, I taught on supplements in my class last week.
Yeah.
And there's a recent recommendation from the Physicians for Responsible Medicine, I think it was that group, that is petitioning FDA, USDA to include in the next dietary guidelines a recommendation for broad spectrum multivite use. Now, I don't personally feel like we'll see that reflected, but their premise was that many U.S. diets are deficient in several nutrients, and that would kind of be an insurance policy. But again, I think it's really hard to say unless you know how someone is eating, the consistency of their diet, and what their particular nutrient needs are, and whether they're in a stage of life where their needs may be increased, say for pregnancy or lactation, or growth in adolescence. That sometimes that's going to come into play too. And Ash also asked, no, not Ash, David, who asked about Ash in Florida? He also asked about protein supplements. at least in the U.S., and I think in many countries, we get plenty of protein in terms of meeting our basic protein needs for most people. The average consumption for a male in the U.S. is around 100 grams a day, and I think recommended levels are somewhere around 60 to 70. And women, you know, they have higher intakes. And my college students, when I look at that, the young men actually consume more than double the RDA for protein on a typical day. So adding additional protein supplementation, or certainly individual amino acid supplementation, which can sometimes throw ratios off too, is probably not warranted. And that extra protein, if your body's not using it for protein needs, then it's going to go towards fat stores or be utilized for energy and just kind of contribute to your overall calorie intake. So, you know, but again, it's individual. And
we also have a question about the units we were mentioning earlier.
Oh, and David said he also meant adding both, the measures and the percentage.
Oh, that makes sense.
Okay.
We have a question like what are IUs and just the different units that we just mentioned, like milligrams, micrograms. So, I mean, grams is just measurement of weight, and then just different units like micrograms and milligrams are smaller than a gram.
Yeah, we need nutrients, particularly vitamins and minerals, in usually small amounts. And those are measured in these small amounts. The amount we need is very often, sometimes even minuscule. So, you know, it's measured in these very small units. IUs is international units. It's just a measure that's used for some of the fat-soluble vitamins, and I'm trying to think what else, but it's not used across the board. And in some sources, it's not used at all, that an alternate method is used to measure. So it gets confusing even in the nutrition community. And few nutritionists could tell you, except for a few of the nutrients, exactly what your DRI is for all the vitamins and minerals. I mean, we know it for like calcium and iron and the biggies. But, you know, if somebody asked me, what is it for B6, I couldn't tell you right off the top of my head what the exact number need is. So I think that's why we use percentages, and hopefully the new label and any education that goes along with it, which is really an important component, will help people know how to use those percentages, and we'll be able to look at a food and see how it contributes to your overall day. And that's kind of the premise there. I wanted to mention a couple things because the new food label proposal still lists saturated fat, trans fat underneath. We had a few people recommend that they would like to see polyunsaturated fat, monounsaturated fat included, and some food products do that voluntarily now, but it looks like it's still optional on that label. But to list saturated fat and trans fat, and that brings us to a question that has been prominent on the discussion forum, and one that, you know, is one that nutritionists are talking about, that, you know, nutrition scientists are talking about, is the issue of saturated fat and its role in risk of cardiovascular disease, and whether some of what we've learned recently will be reflected in revisions of the dietary guidelines, because the next dietary guidelines, they're revised every 5 years based on new research, what's new, and they don't just give out these recommendations, but there's a huge publication that goes with it that gives all the rationale and the research and what was considered in making that recommendation. And it will be interesting to see how they amend, or if they amend, the recommendation on kind of a broad reduction in saturated fat content. Because the studies that have come out within particularly the last few years are showing that saturated fat has a pretty minimal impact on blood cholesterol overall, like 5% variation in studies. What seems to be significant is when people try to reduce their intake of saturated fat, is what do they replace it with? If you reduce fat, particularly saturated fat, and replace it with refined sugars, carbohydrates.
Like to improve flavor.
Yeah, like some food products, when they reduce the fat, they increase the carb.
Yeah.
And sometimes from refined carbs, so that's not a good replacement, and that potentially has more adverse effects than just consuming the product as is with the saturated fat content. The other component, too, is the balance of the fats, that if you replace saturated fats with more omega-6 type fatty acids, which are your soy oils, your corn oils. Remember, all fats are blends, though, so all fats have saturated, poly, mono, across the board. It's just they have more of one potentially than another. But if people replace saturated fats with more omega-6, say switching from butter to a corn oil margarine, that the benefit of that is questionable. I'm not saying you should eat butter all the time, but and the other aspect too is how omega-3s play in.
Right, because omega-6s are necessary for our body, but when we consume too much of them, they have an inflammatory effect on us, which is related to disease states.
Right.
So just that omega-3 versus omega-6 ratio is really important. So generally, Americans, we consume too many omega-6s.
Right. Disproportionate amount of omega-6 versus omega-3s, which are in some of your nuts, and your cold water fish is your richest source, and in, say, some greens and things like that in lower levels. But that proportion, and that it seems to have a protective effect against any potential effects of saturated fat when you have more omega-3s in your diet. But I think part of the message is that when you look at the studies, that distribution of saturated, poly, mono doesn't seem to have as big an impact as other factors. Body weight, keep maintaining a healthy body weight. Gender plays into it. There's things that impact risk more than just that proportion of fat, saturated fat. And it remains that fat is the densest source of calories in our diet.
Yeah, 9 calories per gram.
Right, versus
protein
4.
And carbs are 4 calories per gram.
Dense source of calories. And one thing I tell my students, not I'm anti-fat by any means, because I think fat in our diet, particularly healthy levels of the healthy fats, that there's not only room for it, it's a necessity to include these healthy fats. But fat is also a dense source of calories, and fat is also doesn't contribute any volume to your diet. So like when you put mayonnaise on a sandwich, you don't get more bites out of that sandwich. When you fry a piece of chicken, you don't get any more bites out of the chicken. When you add oil to a salad or to a dish, you don't get more bites out of that dish. So it adds no volume to the diet. And sometimes that's one way that for at least some people, they can moderate calorie intake if they're overweight and need to lose weight. I'm not saying go no fat or super low fat. It's just kind of take a look at some of these added sources of extra fat, particularly if they're not coming from healthy sources. But, the message with saturated fat, I think, is, again, moderation. And the source of the fat, that saturated fat, whether it's coming from highly saturated animal foods or from plant foods like coconut oil and palm oil, tend to be very highly saturated oils. And the recommendations have kind of blanketed everybody. And a lot of these things, like with coconut oil, it seems to have overall a neutral effect on blood lipids, but it's not something that people want to start eating by the tablespoon or spreading on everything. That it's not necessarily going to be a huge benefit. It's just that it may not have the adverse effect. And again, though, there's a lot of research coming out on all these things, on all these different aspects of saturated fat, the type of fatty acid, the length of the fatty acid. All those things come into play. And I don't have the answers in terms of me individually. And I was telling Heather earlier, I'm not doing the research, with subjects. I'm not testing my own blood and seeing how I respond personally to things. What I learn about, say, saturated fat is what I read, what's coming out in the medical literature, what's coming out from credible websites. What do credible health organizations that have consensus statements from experts recommend, and how do you weigh all that? And for the average consumer, it's impossible to keep up with all the changing messages in nutrition. So you have to step back and kind of look at it in context of a whole diet, that we need to think about our overall lifestyle, our overall diet, and get away from some of these spotlight, so to speak, on individual dietary components. We do know, for example, that trans fat raises bad cholesterol, LDL, and even as much as a 2.2 gram intake can raise cardiovascular disease risk significantly. So we know that trans fats, which are found in a lot of your processed and packaged foods that have been partially hydrogenated, would have more. And we know we need to cut back that. But saturated fat appears to not only raise bad cholesterol, potentially, which has kind of been its little cloak of villainous around it, but some studies have failed, and some recommendations have also failed to say that it also raises good cholesterol, HDL. So, you know, and it appears that some of the plant sources of saturated fats may have more potential benefits than some of the animal sources.
So it just depends on that fatty acid profile, where it's coming from.
And I've probably confused people more than helped them. I know. So what about dairy fat, though?
Yes, so we've noticed, this has been on the discussion board too, about dairy. Should I consume it? Is it bad? And on the Rate Your Plate survey we had you take during the first week, and that's a pre-course survey and a post-course survey, that some students were concerned about the question about the trans fat and saturated fat
being lumped together.
Yeah, we lumped those into one question, and that we asked, do you limit these in your diet? And we took this Rate Your Plate survey from the United States Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and we adapted their tool, and that was just released in 2014. We adapted it to try to fit our students better, and it's only 10 questions, so it doesn't give the profile of your whole health status or nutritional status, because that would be a very lengthy survey if we wanted to really dig deep into it. But we just wanted to give 10 question, just give you an idea of recommendations and if you're following them or not. And your score, we just, as we're grading for this course, it's just based on submission, correct?
Right. Whatever your score is on the Rate Your Plate is not your grade. It is, you get points, you get credit just for submission, regardless of your score. But people were concerned that they were, quote, being, their score was falling because of how they answered those questions. And I can understand that. And, no tool is, number one, perfect, and no tool, we tried to find a tool that was short,
simple,
that came from a group that we felt, had some good foundation in terms of how they put the tool together, and we used it in our first couple of courses, and this one actually is an adapted version from those, just so that we could kind of compare. One thing that's interesting is in the Coursera course, say, versus my undergraduate course of students, the average score on the Rate Your Plate, the one that went up to 28 points, I don't know how high this one goes.
Oh, this one I believe is 20.
Okay. Lower points?
Yeah.
Well, the old one, and that's the only one I can think of right now, is out of 28 points, my undergraduate students score about 18. So in that, there's room for improvement range. When I looked at my Coursera students for the last 2 offerings and what their score was using that instrument, they scored close to 23 out of 28 at
higher.
Baseline, just coming in.
Right.
So what that shows is the students in this course already are consuming pretty healthy diets. These are people, and all of you are already conscious about nutrition. You probably are also very aware of what you're consuming and likely keep up with what's being said in the literature and the media, and are critical consumers in terms of the products they buy and the information and how they apply that in their lives. So it was, and my students in my course improved their score overall. They usually jump from, say, an average of 18 at the beginning to around 20 to 21 towards the end. My Coursera students had some increase, but it was very subtle. And part of the reason was they started great. So you don't have as much room for improvement when you're already pretty good. So it's been an interesting comparison for me to look at the student body in Coursera, which averages about 35 years of age, about 60% female, 40% male in our courses, more than 170 countries. Most students in this course and most Coursera courses are already college graduates or even postgraduate type work. So highly educated individuals seeking more information. And, I love to be challenged. That's how I learn as well. And I'm certainly not the end-all for recommendations. I just try to share what's out there and how quickly it can change, which is also both fun and frustrating and sometimes, intimidating, because it's very hard as an individual to keep up with everything that's going on in the nutrition world.
Right.
So I guess I've been rattling on for a while.
Yeah, so we wanted to bring up the dairy question.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Low fat versus full fat. And we looked through some resources, and what did we find? We found that...
Where is it?
Well, we found multiple studies, and just as she was mentioning earlier with saturated fat, dairy has saturated fat in it, and we found that increasing dairy, some does increase your HDL cholesterol, and
some of the more positive aspects of saturated fat in terms of its positive benefit potentially on cardiovascular disease was in relation to dairy and full-fat dairy. Not saying that people should start drinking full-fat dairy if they're not consuming dairy now, but that's what the studies are indicating. And what was interesting too is when you looked at low-fat, fat-free dairy consumption versus just the fuller fat products, that you didn't see that significant a difference in terms of impact on body weight, which is, I think, the motive many people use beyond even the fat content to drink lower fat products. I mean, I buy 1% milk, and it's fortified. You mentioned this earlier.
Vitamin D.
Vitamin D and cultures.
Oh, yeah.
Acidophilus and bacillus.
Yogurts. So there are some benefits of dairy. Dairy can be part of a healthy diet, but it's not necessarily required to be part of a healthy diet. Yogurts, probiotics, that's good for digestive health. And
that dairy question's always a hot one in these courses.
But we appreciate your discussion and,
and
helping you find resources.
And I just want to reiterate, and I usually say this in the discussion forum too, I'm not pro-dairy, I'm not anti-dairy. I think it's a choice of individuals, and definitely it's often a cultural choice, that it's a reflection of the cultural aspect of dairy in the diet. And that you can certainly have a fully and completely healthy diet with no dairy, that it's not necessarily a critical component of a healthy diet, that you can certainly have a diet without it. So you want to look at a few questions?
Yes, we have about 10 more minutes.
Wow, we've been yakking.
Yes.
If you were, the NIH statement, that if you're on vitamin supplements, there's not need to stop. If you're not taking them, there's no reason to start. That's from Tim. I'm not familiar with that specific statement. A lot of the studies didn't show benefit necessarily from vitamin mineral supplementation, and some even showed negative effects. But, Tim, tune in next week. It's on dietary supplements is our class, and I talk about and show a lot of these studies, which kind of sadly, or I don't know if that's the right word, do not show benefit from supplementation for the most part, but show even in some cases adverse effects. But again, there's not a unified consensus across everyone in terms of the use or misuse of supplements. So,
Paul is asking about food replacement products and like protein shakes, and if they're okay, and they seem to have a balanced amount of vitamins and minerals and protein intake, but do you have any comment on these meal replacement shakes?
Well, I think it depends on how you're using them. I mean, inherently to replace a meal. Having worked for many years in the weight management area, excuse me, for some people, that was how they succeeded in losing weight. Now, whether they kept it off or not, I don't know, or many didn't keep it off. But it eliminated that decision for that meal in terms of I'm going to have this much of this and that much of that, and learning to stop, learning to choose. Your decisions are made. There it is. And for some folks, it fit with their personality, their behavior, their lifestyle in such a way that that was the way, at least for a couple meals a day, they moderated their calorie intake and avoided some of the temptations that they might have had. Now, the challenge with that is you still are going to have to learn to eat real food quote, even after the use of these. But for some people, and when the National Weight Control Registry, which tracks people that have successfully lost weight and maintained that weight loss for at least 5 years, and you have to have lost at least 50 pounds and maintained a 50-pound weight loss for 5 years to even be in this study. And there's thousands of successful losers, so to speak. And what we find with that is that they lost weight in all different ways. Meal replacements, commercial programs, low fat, low carb, calorie counting, all over the place, that there was not one type of, quote, diet that jumped out as being the best.
Right.
That people lost weight however worked for them. Now the maintenance seemed to have some characteristics that were in common, and that was, eating less fat overall, not necessarily restricting really low, but that kind of reflected moderation in calories, being very active, having strong support systems, and monitoring their weight, their intake, self-accountability type tools. So I'm getting off the subject a little bit, but in terms of, I don't think they're unsafe necessarily. I don't think you should replace all your meals with them because you might be missing out on some of the phytochemicals, some of the fiber. But, for somebody that's trying to limit their calories or moderate their calories, sometimes that's
might be more practical.
It may be more practical for them.
So.
And of course, everybody's going to have a different view on that as well. I don't know about that one. Let's see. What about the fatty fish? Somebody, Mar. Fatty fish, that's like salmon, mackerel, some odd fish called scrod or something like that, or shad that I hadn't heard of before. But your fish that are typically cold water fish, they tend to have higher amounts of omega-3 fatty acid. Vitamin D is richer in those type of fats. So those people that consume, quote, fatty fish a time or two a week tend to have better profiles in terms of some of those components of their diet. But again, I have a lot of people that are, eating primarily plant-based diets and eliminating fish as well. And, you just have to look for other sources of some of these nutrients in that. But when you talk about omega-3 fatty fish, cold water fish comes up constantly because it, by far, in terms of our diet, is the richest source of that. Mercury. Pat's asking about mercury in fish consumption.
That's a hot topic in the news right now. And it's been recommended that women who are pregnant or children, they should limit their mercury intake. So those fish are typically the ones that are the more predatory ones, so the bigger fish, as in like tuna. So I know that's been a hot topic on the news with the tuna. Right. Can you speak to this at all?
Well, it's potentially just contaminants in water making its way either, like you say, from fish consuming fish or just getting into the tissues, and that certain types of fish like tilefish, I think, is it swordfish? I don't want to name fish if I'm not sure, but there's certain varieties of fish that tend to be potentially higher in mercury content. And like in pregnant women, and the risk of issues related to mercury in their unborn child, that it's recommended that they limit the consumption of those fish to a certain amount a week. However, the new recommendations really encourage pregnant women to consume fish, just not to consume excessive amounts. And the reason of that is the importance of the omega-3s in brain development of the fetus and all the other health attributes of omega-3. So, there are certain varieties of fish that tend to be high mercury, and maybe that's not the type of fish you eat 3 or 4 times a week, but one that you might eat more moderate amounts of less frequently. And maybe we can post that. I forget what they all are, and I don't want to say a name of a fish and then give it a bad name when it's not.
And once we consume the mercury, does it just build up in our bodies and we don't excrete it? Is that correct?
A lot of your minerals aren't excreted through the urine, that they are, can store up in different tissues. And, I'm not entirely sure, to tell you the truth. I think it's mercury in somewhat in terms of cognitive development and some of the aspects of that. Many of the most commonly eaten fish are lower in mercury. Thank you, Ash. These include salmon, shrimp, pollocks, tuna, light canned, tilapia, catfish, and cod. So the fish that are most commonly consumed, Ash tells us, thank you, are ones that are not a mercury risk.
I don't think Ash gave us that.
Oh, we didn't?
No.
Somebody wrote from FDA.
We found it on the FDA.
Oh, you found it?
Yes, we did.
Oh, sorry, Ash, but thank you
Technology.
Anyway.
All right, we can probably field one more question. So we're scanning through the questions.
Here's Paul. He's saying, does food labeling cover up some hidden unhealthy stuff? I.e. more used for marketing rather than health reasons. Sugar-free but hidden high carb. The way the ingredient, I mean, they shouldn't list all the nutrients in that food product. I think where you might get into some hidden items maybe in the ingredient list, because right now able to group together certain flavorings, certain colors together, and not necessarily spell those out individually. The health implications of that are going to vary, and again, there's more research coming out on that. Truth in labeling, at least here in the U.S., they're supposed to declare all those things, allergens, the source of what they're using. When a product's made sugar-free, usually they're using an artificial sweetener or a non-nutritive sweetener as a replacement for the sugar to reduce the calories, and not necessarily another type of sugar, that wouldn't change the calorie content. So, but if you look at a lot of those products and you compare the modified one with the quote regular one, oftentimes there are more subtle differences than you realize, and that sometimes even the modified product may ultimately be higher in calories, or in some products higher in grams of carb, or so you have to kind of to look at that. It's hard to keep up with it all. Okay, how we doing on time?
We have like 2 minutes.
2 more minutes. This has been great. I hope you come back and join us next week, and we will look through the questions too. Oh, we had a question last week that Heather looked into about the kind of national diet proposals in Sweden. And what did you learn about that? That a question was that Sweden, or a comment from one of our students was that Sweden was adopting a higher fat, lower carb kind of national diet. And what did you find?
And I was struggling to find what was actually true, because a lot of the media sources that I saw said that they do have this national diet that's high fat, low carb, but then one resource cited a dietitian or nutritional professional in Sweden saying that that wasn't a national policy, but it was a prominent finding from a research study. So the media might have translated into that saying it's a national guideline. So I put on the discussion forum that question. So if any of you are from Sweden or familiar with it, we'd love to hear your input.
And I was interested too in what's considered high fat, low carb. What's the percent of fat? Right. What's the percent of carb, and how is that defined? And I think you said from what you'd seen, it really wasn't that different than the upper ends or lower ends of what's already recommended.
Right.
So that would be interesting if you find. And if you haven't checked out, if you're in the course and you haven't checked out, it's interesting, and it's interesting the passion of the participants that participate in the forum, and also the questions they raise and the support that they give one another, and the answers, and the credible links that I see within there. So, and Heather's continuing to update the Nutrition in the News navigation bar that gives some newer nutrition information. So check that out too.
So we have one more question that came in from one of our viewers from India. She says, I'm from India and we have our own dairy farm. I boil my milk 2 times and remove the cream and then use it. I collect that cream and make ghee, which is fat. What are the effects of this fat on LDL and HDL?
I don't know. That would be that saturated milk fat.
Yeah. So it's like you're skimming your own milk, and then you're using that skimmed portion, so the fat that you took off, and making ghee with it. So that is a good question, and
I wouldn't have a specific answer. I mean, I would think about some of the studies that we looked at that looked at higher fat milk products and the saturated fat content in that, and that those actually had some beneficial risk reduction with cardiovascular disease. Not significant, but I don't know. That's a good question in terms of that specifically. And but that's fun. That's interesting. Okay.
All right. We're out of time, but
thank you.
So next week is dietary supplements, correct?
Right. Next week's dietary supplements.
And we'll have another virtual office hour at 12 p.m. Central Time here in the United States. So we'll send another link out about that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.